Welcome to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism in Modern Life, hosted by Adam Piercy and Mick Mulroy. Welcome back to Pub and Porch, Applied Stoicism. I'm your host, Adam Piercy, with my co-host, Mick Mulroy. Today it's extremely cold with a fresh dusting of snow here in Canada. Mick, you've just returned from some time in the field, I think we would call it. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about some of the current events going on that are, I think, shaking up the world again in a way that maybe many people were hoping might not happen again. But Mick, why don't you tell us where you're coming from today?
Yes, thanks, Adam. So, yes, my company, Lobo Institute, also, in addition to doing the humanitarian aid delivery through another company called Fogbow, we do tactical training. So we train special operations units from the military and other in how to do winter warfare, mountain warfare, all sorts of different things, including the new part of warfare, which is integrating drones into ground operations. But anyway, that's not what we're talking about. But I was down with my team, including my business partner Eric Ulrich, who not only is one of the co-founders, is one of our expert trainers, but training a bunch of folks from the Naval Special Warfare component of SOCOM. One, inspiration for the next generation, super motivated, dedicated professionals there, who, as I mentioned, are Pub and Porch fans, and that was before the training course. So, yes, it also shows that Stoicism is still alive and growing, and that's what they told me inside the military. And before I get back to the current event you just referenced, there is a trend in some militaries in the West for a nationalist flavor, which is not to be confused with patriotism. It's more xenophobic and supremacist philosophy. It is absolutely essential that doesn't take root in the military. Mm-hmm. And the idea that Stoicism, which has always been ingrained in Western militaries, especially now the United States, is a counterbalance that I think needs to be dominant, if you will. Right. Sure. Side note, but an important one. So anyway, at the very end, literally, we had the last night, we had our barbecue, which in Lobo standards means elk burgers, elk steaks, elk brats, and antelope, by the way. Then that night, woke up because a lot of the major networks are told in advance to keep their analyst ringers on, right? And, at ease on the cocktails. So you could jump up and start talking about what happened. And what happened is the U.S. and Israel elected to initiate combat operations in the midst of negotiations, right? So the next negotiation milestone was supposed to be tomorrow, Monday, in Vienna. And obviously that's not going to happen. The U.S. and Israel initiated strikes that decapitated the regime. Literally, there's around 40 leaders in Iran, from Khomeini, the supreme leader, on down, defense secretary or defense minister, their equivalent national security advisor, their equivalent of JSOC, SOCOM, CIA, all dead. And of course, also the nuclear facilities and ballistic missiles. But that, again, is not the purpose of this podcast, but it did spark our discussion on talking about Stoicism's view of war, Stoics in war, right? Because I already mentioned, as you well know, there's been a long history of Stoicism inside the military. Probably where it really just cemented was during the Roman Empire. I think there was at one time when every legion heir would have said he was a Stoic, and meant it. And I think that has carried on, whether it's in the British or any of the European countries' military, but especially the British, and then on to the U.S., Canada, and is still in existence today. So That being said, oftentimes those who fight war or have been in one are actually less likely to start one because the consequences of those decisions are felt and known by that person. We have a situation today where very few, at least elected leaders in the US at the highest level, have served. But in the past, it was not only expected, especially from the Stoic philosophy, for you to have served, but you have to have served in a manner that was the tip of the spear, to use a overused expression, right? So starting, I'll just kick off with the first one and then throw it back to you, Adam, for your initial thoughts.
Sure.
But again, I don't think, if you look at the Spartans, who were known to be one of the finest warrior class in history, if not they were actually very hesitant to go to war. They had all sorts of restrictions. They had to, pass it through two kings and, their equivalent of a legislative body. And they weren't the warmongers that some people might expect. They were the war fighters that were hesitant to actually enter the war itself. But again, I'll start with Cato. And I think when it comes to war, it also matters about what it is you're fighting for, right? War is not a blanket right or wrong. One would say Cato, of course, who I think was the model for the gladiator and the movie Gladiator, predates, of course, Marcus Aurelius, but he fought against Julius Caesar. He fought for the Republic. He fought for the democratic concept that was Rome. And he fought to the death. And he was even offered a chance to get his life spared. And instead, he committed, the noble death, suicide, rather than to be captured. And even Caesar thought very highly of him. But he kind of set the standard not only for, I think, the Stoic soldier. So the quintessential Stoic soldier to me, and more important, people like George Washington, was Cato. Yeah. And his war was a just war. You're fighting for your country and the democratic principles that was the Roman Republic against tyranny, which was an autocrat that wanted to throw all that out the window. So I think that kind of sets the standard for us, Stoics, and both how we face and serve, and also the wars that we would find just.
Yeah. Yeah, and then just a quick word on Cato, actually, because I'm reading the biography of Cato called Rome's Last Citizen, and I'll put it in the show notes. Cato actually served before he served in any political office. He served because you always had to serve as I can't remember if it was a legionary. I think he might have been an equite, which means he had a horse.
A horse, yeah.
But he was a very interesting leader because he himself would dig the ditches, set the spikes up, because they would set this spiked wall in the ditches on the outside to protect the encampments and everything. And very famously, he walked into his first ever command off of his horse, walked in not wearing a helmet so that everybody could see who he was, and very much a warrior leader fighting on the front lines, literally. And became quite beloved by his troops. When he left at the end of his service term, apparently there was the usual stuff of like ritual sacrifices for his goodwill and everything, but there were people weeping about that. So I think he is a good example.
That's a great story.
Overall,
so you should definitely put that was a great story. You should put that book in the notes for sure.
It's a really good book. It's detail heavy, so I sometimes have to go back over it. But I think the way I look over this in general, right, like, as someone who grew up in Europe, right, war is very visible in many ways because you're living in a place that went through one of the few places in the West that went through an extreme level of warfare in the 20th century, right? And so I have walked the battlefields at the National Memorial for Canada, which is at Vimy Ridge, and I've walked the battlefields at a place called Beaumont Hamel, which is it's a national war memorial, but it's for Newfoundland. It's where the Royal Newfoundland Regiment was obliterated, I think is the right way to say. 1,000 men, first day of the Somme, 100 guys for roll call the next morning. And I've seen that up close. And so I have always grown up to be a pacifist. But the thing is, the Stoics they're pacifists in a different kind of way as I see it. They don't wish to go to war. They look at war as they would call it a dispreferred indifferent. They don't wish to go there. It's a wish not to have that happen, but sometimes it happens and you cannot change that. The path of events of the world will sometimes just occur. And that's how I think they all would generally say that they would see it. Now, they have their own quotes about it, right? I mean, I think Seneca would consider war to be madness or national madness in some ways. And I think you talk about, I think you said, did you use the term just war or you use the term?
Yes.
Yeah, just war. Yeah, and I think for Stoics, a just war is one built on duty and obligation, and removes the vices of things like greed or anger towards those others. And I think that that's the thing I really, for myself, have really been focusing on as I've been doing a bit of research for today's episode, because we're not academics, but we do like to know what we're talking about. So you and I both do a bit of research. But ultimately, I think that's where I focus on what's going on right now. If something is justified because it protects others, if it sometimes, we have Stoic commanders like Marcus Aurelius, whose military actions were done to actually prevent further military incursions from like invading tribes and whatnot. Those are things that to me, I think make a lot of sense. I'm kind of the weird pacifist where it's more like my preferred indifferent is peace, because nobody wants this to happen, but I understand that bad things can happen and we have to be careful there. I also, I have never served, and I have to be very honest, so I have a very different probable view on that than others, but that's how I see this, at least, from the get-go. It's one of those things where I think as Stoics, there's a long history, even our progenitor Socrates, of having them fight on the front lines. But I really never get this sense from them that they're doing that for a personal gain. They're doing that for some sort of aggressive act, in the sense of, like, even Cato, right? Like, Cato aligns with Pompey and fights Caesar, loses at Utica, right, as you've already said, and takes his own life afterwards, right? But Cato, in many ways, tried to fight off the war from occurring, weird pun there, for a long period of time, right? And in fact, when Julius Caesar was first coming to power, Cato was lambasting him for his war crimes in Gaul. And you kind of go like, oh, this is very interesting when you think about it. You've got a person who is calling out his rival for their terrible acts of aggression during the war, but also is picking up a sword on their own side. And I think that's kind of how Stoics would look at it. It's a last resort, but it's something that we must do. And the vigilance, the responsibility, and the duty that you and I talk about is to make sure that we don't forget that sometimes you have to fight for this stuff. You have to fight for freedom. You have to fight for the safety of others. And that's, I think, a key thing when you think about Stoicism in war. What I think you and I could both agree, there is no Stoic who preaches an aggressive stance on this. I don't think I've ever really read that. The Roman idea of forward defense, where they would invade a place or attack a place to subdue it because they knew that they were going to attack them later, that's kind of up for debate. But I've never seen a Stoic with a stance that's aggressive, in the sense of, like, if you see somebody's land and you like it, go take it. But I'd be curious your view on that, because but that's really what I have not seen in my life for the past 10 years as being a practicing Stoic. And that's an interesting one for me, is just, we want a strong defense. You have to be vigilant and make sure that you earn the peace that you have. But ultimately, many Stoics aren't. It doesn't seem like they're really in for the whole aggressive stance. What's your take, though?
I think it's consistent with that. So, I mean, you have the wars that you don't choose. Take Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
Noble or not, they're going to fight for their own country, and they didn't choose to start the war. So we could take that out. And then the other types of war are the wars of choice. And it depends on what the choice is about.
Yeah.
So in the U.S., as Churchill said, you can count on the Americans to do the right thing after they exhausted every other option. We eventually got in the war to liberate Europe, the one, the war you were just talking about. That was a war of choice. Didn't have to.
Yeah.
We were separated by oceans, and we had the benefit of geographic distance. But that was a war of choice, and I would argue, not that I at all speak for all Stoics, but I would argue that the Stoic view of that is it's a just war. It's liberating the continent of Europe from Nazi occupation, right? Or
Yeah.
in the Pacific, which doesn't get as near as much attention, the brutality of the imperial Japanese,
Mm-hmm.
empire was astonishingly horrible,
Yeah.
and liberating the Indo-Pacific was equally, I think, noble. And I think that's what the key word is for Stoics when it comes to war, is nobility of it. Maybe an overused term. Most people that spent a lot of time in war, even if it was completely just, start having a very cynical view of it. But that, I think, is an important point. I think from a Stoic perspective, one should be hesitant to ever use force. But I also think there's an obligation to have the ability uh, and the capability to defend your country in a way that most people wouldn't ever want to attack it. Right. One way to
Right.
avoid war is to be, uh, walk softly and carry a big stick. Right.
Sure.
So you just don't want people to challenge you. That's why I think it's absolutely essential for any country, really,
Right.
to maximize their capability to defend themselves.
Yeah.
If that was the case, in most cases, the bully of the world would not decide to launch an attack. They
Right.
simply could lose. The other part of that, which I think is very much in line with Stoic philosophy, is alliances. If you have an alliance with other countries, every country in that alliance does the needful to prepare, defend itself, defend its allies. The chances of that alliance being attacked goes down substantially.
Yeah.
It's literally the premise that won the Cold War, right?
Sure.
With NATO. Um,
Yeah.
so, not to veer into foreign policy and national defense policy, but I think from the Stoic perspective, you have an obligation to be self reliant. And as a nation, that means the capacity to defend yourself.
Yeah.
And that also, of course, means going on the offensive if need be.
Yeah.
And you have an obligation as part of alliance to do the same. And you
Mm-hmm.
should be in an alliance of like-minded, democratically aligned, in our case, Canada and the United States, aligned countries.
Sure.
And you should also not take that alliance for granted, which is a whole other discussion. But
Yeah.
um,
We've had that
so,
one.
yeah, we have had that one. Um,
Yeah.
Other Stoics that I would say throughout history, obviously Marcus Aurelius, we talk about him all the time.
Yeah.
He was the emperor general that was an example of servant leadership, like you mentioned, Cato was as well. But you also had George Washington, who had his forces watch Cato, the play about
That's
Cato,
right.
prior to launching a major attack that turned the tide
Yeah.
of the Revolutionary War. And you've had generals and leaders throughout history, Churchill being one I would say is a great example, although might not have held himself out as a Stoic like we do, was clearly versed in Stoicism.
Yeah.
And in many cases, maybe not the moderation, but in many cases exemplified Stoicism when it came to bravery and self-reliance and resilience in the face of Nazi aggression. So I
Yeah.
think there's a lot of examples throughout history. Obviously, my old boss, Secretary Mattis, is a well-known modern
Mm-hmm.
Stoic, and but before him, Admiral Stockdale, the
That's
fighter
right.
pilot philosopher, not only was a well-known Stoic, but wrote about it pretty extensively.
Yeah.
So I think there is a way that a Stoic views himself in defense. I think there's a way, or herself. I think there's a way that Stoics look at warfare and what's just and what's not. And I think that is what would be most needed in modern society on how
Absolutely.
and when to. You should, the Reagan doctrine. basically you should have such a large, most powerful military that you'd never have to use it because nobody would ever consider challenging it.
Right.
If I think the Stoics of the world, and certainly the countries of the free world, were to take that view, which they're finding out now, to be fair,
Sure.
and they're doing it now, more importantly,
Right.
we would all be better off. But you can't be also the one that, in my opinion, is the pacifist because you happen to be surrounded by people who are willing to defend you.
Yeah.
you
Sure.
you need to understand that it's not, freedom isn't free. In other words, I'm sorry for all the cliches, but they do fit. Um, you have to fight for it. You have to be willing to fight for it, and you
Yeah.
have to be willing to fight for it in a way that your enemies don't want anything to do with that.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, we've been doing a lot of discussing today, and I think this is great, about Stoicism and war. And I think it would be important to pivot a little bit to talk about what I have been thinking of more as like Stoicism at war. So we have a lot of service members who listen to us, apparently. You were telling me about some recently. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, one thing that I came across quite a bit in my reading was Stoicism at war. One thing that's interesting, and actually William Spears kind of talks about this in his book,
Yes.
which is called Stoicism as a Warrior Philosophy. It was, when you think about Stoicism at war, like how do you take that into war? And I think the one thing for sure that I saw as an arc throughout my reading was around just conduct and morally, ethically good conduct. So things like the protection of non-combatants seems to come up a lot. Not, they don't call it that. Non-combatant is sort of a modern term, right? Because back in the day, if uh, if Athens was fighting Corinth, then they were kind of all bad, right? But in the modern world, this idea around non-combatants and the protection of the innocent or the weak or whatever, while you're carrying that out, I think is something people would think of as a part of a modern concept. But you see it with a lot of Stoics, where it's like, we fight the battle and the battle ends and we're not doing anything else. Marcus very clearly, like once he pushes the Marcomanni back over the Danube, he does not encroach further on their territory. He sets up a treaty and he says, look, we've had enough of this. Let's go forward. And so this is, now I have not served, so I'm not telling somebody to be a certain way, but I will say that there seems to be this theme around just conduct, right? Justice and benevolence for others, even while doing this. Like, it sounds funny, but it is something that I think is kind of prevalent there, and you see this with so many others. Even Cato, like Cato loses at Utica, right? And he essentially, his conduct essentially sort of settles things down because there's worry about reprisals against his troops or reprisals against Caesar's troops when they come in to take over the land or whatever. And Cato kind of evens a lot of that out, and he says, "Look, we lost." Right. And he makes a personal choice to take his own life, but he certainly does not tell every other legionnaire to do that. And, so I think that's a really important thing for me. Now, it's funny when we talk about this because there are people who I think embody Stoic values in much of their conduct who have asked for things like carpet bombing and fire bombing in the past. And I'm not going to quote on that because ultimately I'm not in that circumstance. But I think in general, every Stoic would say, you fight the fight and then you act justly towards people afterwards, even if they lose, right? Even if they're terrible. And I mean, we were talking recently on an earlier, or at least we're talking about it in an earlier episode about the movie Nuremberg, right? About the Nuremberg war trials.
Absolutely.
There was still an act of justice that took place there, right? Like they didn't just do what's called a drumhead trial, which is what the British Empire used to do back in the day, where they would upend a drum and some general would sit there and dispense military justice, and it was extreme, right? It was, and the penalties were extremely harsh. Instead, they said, no, we have to act justly here. We have to do this right. And are all of those people Stoic? You and I aren't saying that. At least I'm not saying that. But I think there's a value there that I think has to be there if you're going to go forward with this. And remember that you have to act justly towards those while doing these things, because ultimately, if you don't, in my mind, and this is what I think Seneca would say and some of the others would say, the moment you stop doing that, you are harming yourself even more than you are harming those innocents, right? Or civilians. Anyways, that's my take on that. And again, this is from someone who has never served, but it was a theme that I could sort of see running in the background, right? But I'd be interested in your take on it, because we've talked a lot about Stoics at war, but like Stoic conduct is almost a topic in and of itself, right?
Yes, absolutely. And how you act in war is um, a virtue or not that will carry with you the rest of your life. I just found a quote from Seneca that said, "I would rather compete in virtue than in wealth or power." So it's also, I think, applicable to why wars can be fought, why wars have been fought throughout the ages. Of course, many of them have been fought for wealth. Let's be fair. World domination is not, even though it was cloaked, and we talked about this in colonialism episode, it's often cloaked in, we're here to help the savages, etc., when really it's just the exploitation of their natural resources that generally doesn't end up helping, obviously not savages, but people that live there that are different than you. But so the virtue of war does matter. And that is something I think as a country, and you mentioned Nuremberg, but after World War II, there was a series of conventions that was done by the international community to avoid the horrors that we saw in that war, and literally every war before that, right?
Yeah.
But the carpet bombing of Dresden, obviously the attempted extermination of a race of people. But the Geneva and the Hague Conventions came out of that. And that was an effort by the international community to avoid, just the human rights catastrophe and war crimes that we saw in World War II. And it's important that those continue to be revisited. And it's important that countries are held to account for violating those.
Right.
I would look specifically at Russia. I mean, Russia not only initiated a war against Ukraine, but has stolen tens of thousands of children. I mean, who would even think of that? I don't even know if there's another time in history where it's happened like that. And then uses the kids that they stole as a bargaining chip for their negotiations, as if that is actually acceptable to steal children and then use it to try to gain things like territorial concessions. Clear violation of just the core of morality of any human being, and obviously a violation of all the protocols we put in place after World War II. So another thing that we have talked about, Stoics should be involved in the world, and and when it comes to not only the defense of your nation, but potentially how the world conducts wars. And you can certainly talk about the wars in Gaza right now. You can talk about other places. It matters, and you're, as a country and as a person, responsible for your own actions. The excuses, well, I did a horrible thing, but they did a horrible thing too, is never acceptable. It's not acceptable in the law, right? And, in basic societal criminal law, it shouldn't be acceptable in modern warfare. But that's, I think, where the Stoic principles can come into play, that if you build a bedrock of virtue, again, I want to compete in virtue rather than power or wealth, you will have a military that essentially stays on the right track. If you become a nationalist based, philosophically based army, then anything your nation does is right, and anything another nation says about it is wrong. Right. So it's not a logical, reasoned out position. It is basically the position of the autocrat. Right. And they just use nationalism, warped form of patriotism as a way to promote it. And I think that's what Stoics and Stoicism can do the most, is can push back in that. And that's why it's so, quite frankly, super cool, not just because they're listening to our podcast. There's plenty of people talking about Stoicism. But the fact that they're so engaged. And that this happens, I talk on television about national security all the time. Sometimes people come up and get togethers and say stuff about that or ask questions, but I get a lot more questions about Stoicism. Really do. And every time I do, it's like, that's great, because this is, if the world could do with more Stoics, that's a very biased thing to say, but um, I think we'd be better off. And if you're interested in the philosophy, do your own homework, but join up. We need more, and we need people beyond. I'm an example of this, but Stoicism is not exclusive to military at all. It's
Right.
it needs to be expanded, and it needs to include people outside of the West, of course. I think the philosophy is, of course, as strong anywhere as it is in the West, or could be,
Yeah.
and it needs to be beyond just males. Nothing wrong with males.
Yeah.
By the way, I had a friend tell me that white men think way too much about the Roman Empire. I was like,
I've heard that too. I don't know that that's true, especially because I am a
"Are you
student of
sure?"
Herodotus. I am a student of Herodotus. I understand that those who choose to ignore history are doomed to repeat it.
That's
But
true, but you just said
I've heard that.
Herodotus, which would then
What's that?
you just quoted Herodotus. So my
Yeah.
friend would say, "That's what I'm talking about."
Well, if it wasn't true, it wouldn't last this long, right?
But he's not a white man. So
No, but I
I
get
was
it.
like, damn. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think no, and I think, but I think that's a good point, right? Like we are pulling from something that comes from our own history, right? And there's many other histories and viewpoints out there. So, in many ways, though, I could say, instead of saying we need more Stoics in the world, I would say we need more rational thinkers in the world. Is
sure,
almost what I would say. That's more universal, right? Like even there are many other philosophies and religions out there that do have a rational basis in this, right? Like a justice, wisdom based um, mindset around stuff. And Buddhism, I think, is one that kind of has that running through it, as well
sure,
as Zen. And so I would agree with you. We talk about the West; it's accessible for us, right, for sure. But
sure.
I think
It's
there's
part
many
of
other
our
things out
culture.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah, it meant, like, if you could even go more base, you could say we need more mindfulness and less mindlessness. It seems like a lot of it is just you get
that's a
angry
good
and you
one.
start yelling at the other person, right? It's us versus them. And I think
Yeah,
that's a struggle as we go through this. So, not to bring this down, but it was interesting. I have always remembered this quote from Einstein about war, which is um, he said something like, um, "Killing under the cloak of war is nothing but an act of murder," and I think that's a very apt description of it in many ways. You are still removing a human life if you do that, but at the same time, I think it's one of those things where that it's definitely a blanket statement. I know it mentions a blanket, but it's definitely a blanket statement about that. I struggle with war because as a pacifist, right, there is violence occurring against other human beings. But at the same time, when you have to defend yourself, sometimes extreme acts are what is required to defend those of the innocent or non-combatants and things like that, right? But I'd be curious about your take on this circumstance because um, you know, you're a boxer, right? I know you have a boxing background, and you are also someone who served in the military. And I like to think about something that I think it's Jigoro Kano, who kind of was the modern inventor of judo, said, which is like, if you meet somebody who actually knows how to fight, they usually fight very rarely. They almost never fight, right? They do not choose violence. And as a service member yourself, I'd be interested to know if you agree with that, because there so much of war we think of as extreme acts of violence, but war can be many things. But what do you think?
well, I think what you just cited as likely is true. The more people that I know that have spent a lot of time in war become far less advocate for it. Not that
Yeah.
they ever would have been an advocate for it, but you tend to start off very gung ho and then realize that a
Hmm.
lot of war is simply for somebody else's greed,
Right.
right? Um, but on the flip side, to Einstein's point, not that it's in agreement with it, but you never would have talked the Nazis out of occupying Europe or
Right.
turning over the concentration camps and releasing the
Yeah.
prisoners. So if you're not willing to use force, in that case, extreme violence and murder, well, not murder, but homicide, murder being
Yeah.
unjustified homicide,
Sure.
um, you never would have liberated Auschwitz or Dachau, right?
Right.
I think we can all agree on that.
Yeah.
So it isn't as simple as saying that you should never have war. The human condition, the human civilization, um, which I don't hold up on a pedestal, but its premise, almost from its inception, has been taking things that we wanted, unfortunately,
Yeah.
or
Conflict.
defending against those that wants to take the things that you have, right? I mean,
Yeah.
as soon as we were able to store things, right, preserve meat, put berries in baskets, somebody decided it's easier to take than to do it ourselves. Again, not justifying it, but it is unfortunately how we evolved, societal and even uh,
Yeah.
individual. So war is going to happen. The principles, and to your point, I think you're right. You don't have to be a Stoic. You can just be a person who reasons, but also the virtue parts of it.
Yeah.
If you are a virtuous person and you view war in that manner, and this is the argument, some people would say you have to be as brutal as your enemy to be effective. I just
Right.
disagree with that. I think ultimately you can be superior to your enemy in both strength and morality.
Right.
And ultimately, I would like to think that that is a combination that wins the day, not the combination of greed and the use of power.
Yeah.
Um, so, and that again, it's just like, if every kid went and learned boxing, for example, the
Hmm.
Irish martial art, the chances of the bully going around the playground stealing lunch money goes way down, right? It
Sure.
just, you never know. You're gonna meet that little kid and try to take his lunch
Yeah.
money, and all of a sudden you're getting,
Walloped.
a great combination that puts you on your butt, right?
Yeah.
So, maybe that's an old school way of looking at it, but the ability to defend yourself is paramount to the ability to keep the peace.
Right.
And so I think that's an obligation of countries to do, and not to just sit on their laurels and hope that the goodness of mankind, hence my diatribe on how we evolved, is going to rule the day.
Right.
It's not. It's
No.
going to require people willing to stand up and defend themselves, and virtue, and I think as part of virtue, democracies.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, there was a Quaker pacifist movement in the UK when Hitler was rising to power, right? And they were very anti-war, and they would say things like, "Well, if we had been able to do something before," and I'm not going to get really into that debate, but like I agree with that to some degree, to many degrees, right? Um, I think it was a good thing that they went because they'd already suffered from the First World War. The League of Nations was already falling apart, for example. I think it was a good thing that they made an effort to try and say, okay, let's try and calm this situation down. Do I think they did enough? Personally, no. I also think it might never have worked anyways, which is kind of what you were saying, right? Like at some point you just see on the writing on the wall, like it's never going to get better. And you're going to have to take some different kind of action. But I think, you know, I think that's something that a Stoic will do, right? They're going to monitor the situation. They're going to make a decision. They're going to try to pivot. They're going to do alliances, whatever they're going to do first. But they don't, so they don't take the decision lightly for warfare, but they also, that's not their first thing. If the first thing you're doing is reaching for the weapon, I think that loses, that sort of rational thought perspective, right? And I think that's just me. Now, there, of course, if you're in defense or in retaliation because of some kind of act happening, well, that's pretty extreme, and I think that's an example that we all can kind of understand. But I think in general, like a Stoic is going to say, okay, so what do we need to do first here, right? Like, is it really this bad? Is there something else we could do? I think in world events that have happened recently, right? Like, people are trying to have talks about this. They're trying to sort out peace processes that are calling for ceasefires and calling for other things to happen. And I think that's good. So you and I are both in agreement. I think like a Stoic does not never reach for the weapon, but I think they understand that there's an arsenal of sort of humanity that you kind of have to try and pull from first. And, that's kind of what we're seeing now, although it's escalating very badly in my mind.
It
But
is. It is.
yeah,
And, this isn't again about the current event, but
no,
in my opinion, it is a war of choice
yeah,
to a certain extent. And so that's going to have to be viewed that way. Hopefully it doesn't last very long, and then and it's over. But the alliances that exist around the world are challenged today.
Yeah.
And that gives countries an opening, whether it's Russia and Ukraine, China potentially, and Taiwan.
Yeah.
They view weak alliances as reasons to take advantage of it. And so I would promote the idea of a strong mutual defense among democratic nations. They could also do it among autocratic nations, but I'm not part of that. So I advocate that they have no alliances, right? And to be honest, they have. I mean, think about Russia, right? So Russia, as soon as Venezuela got in the crosshairs, they didn't do a damn thing to help them. When Assad started falling, they just took off and took them with them. When, the Iranians are going what they're going through right now, which is fine with me, they hadn't done a damn thing for them. So the alliances on the other side are, I think they're questioning how much of an alliance there is between these autocratic, despotic countries, because they are not effective. But we should take the opportunity to shore up our alliances and not break them down, certainly, and challenge their existence.
Well, I think you get to this point where a lot of this comes down to the basis of what was formed, right? So if something is formed based on tyranny and power and greed, those vices always seem to fall away. They always seem to fall apart, right? But when you base something on justice and wisdom and the courage to stand up for the will of the people and, tempering things so that, we're not always jumping towards the aggressive action, right? Those things are sort of universal and they always last this long, right? Like every time, look, the first triumvirate of Rome, which was Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, right? Like essentially it's three guys vying for power and two of them are super duper rich and the other one is super duper popular and it was just ultimate greed, right? And all that. And Caesar, there was a facade to what he was doing because he was leading the popularis movement, which was like for the people, and he was selling it as the idea of trying to get land for his troops and wanting to, do all these reforms and everything. And I'm not saying that I disagree with that, but ultimately it was a veil for what he really wanted, which was to be, imperator and dictator for life. And the thing is when you build things on those vices, you're starting on a foundation with cracks, right? And I think that's a key thing here. So, when I lead a team, I lead a team of safety engineers in the space program, right? And we build our team. Our motto is tough and competent, which, if anybody from the space program knows, is a Gene Kranz phrase from after the Apollo 1 fire. And so we built it on a good value that to us has, it's ethically good and it's just, and it takes a little bit of wisdom and some courage. And so it's based on these real values that form a really strong foundation for us. And the team's held together really well under some very tough circumstances. But, if you form it like working in I'm not trying to equate a war to working in the tech sector, but if you work in a team where it's like, we'll just get it done as fast as we can, who cares about whatever, right? Those teams, they never seem to have a foundation there. And it's an easy example for me to talk about because I didn't serve and I'm not in the war, but it is that thing of like, whatever you build your foundation on is going to be where the fruits of the labors come from. And I think that's a key thing here, right? If you're building it out of fear and power grabbing and injustice, those regimes never survive. They just can't. I don't think they have enough to. But yeah, so we should probably wrap up there. Do you have any closing thoughts for us today, Mick?
I do. I mean, ultimately, I think the way people should view war is to avoid it at all costs. But once you're in it, to win it. Sorry, again, another cliche. I didn't even mean that one. But that's how I think you would avoid the wars in the first place, is if you are willing. And, another conversation we had yesterday at the closing of our training is, from the U.S. perspective, there's no guarantee that we're going to have dominance in the military throughout history. You can look at history and realize that's not the case, right? So from our perspective, I think that is where we need to be We need to be the strongest in the world and the best in the world. So hopefully, and the best being aspire to be virtuous and righteous and use reason. And I think if you anybody, no matter what side of the political fence you sit on, if you want to think of a leader in wartime, I think you want him to epitomize just what you just said. You literally just laid it out, so I don't need to repeat it. But if you hit those virtues, that is, I think, where most people would want their leaders to be in conflict.
Totally. So I'll take one last second to say, for all those service men and women out there who listen to us, we're thinking about you, and thank you for your service. And this is coming from someone who's never served, but Mick knows I give him a shout every November 11th. But we want to make sure that we say thank you to everybody who listens. So we'd love to hear from you. info@pubandporch.com. Give us a comment. All of those wonderful things. But for now, Mick and I are going to sign off. So cheers, Mick.
Slacha. Thank you for listening to the Pub and Porch podcast. If you'd like to find out more about the podcast or its host, head over to pubandporch.com, and you can listen to all our episodes on Spotify, Apple, or whichever platform you prefer. And if you'd like to help out with the podcast, you can find us on Patreon. Drop us an email if you have a comment on any past episode, you have a suggestion for future episodes, or you have an essay on an important topic for Stoicism. Send it to us, and then we can be reached at info@pubandporch.com. Today's music was provided by bensound.com. Until next time, Pub and Porch out.